You've seen it, right? You walk down any grocery aisle, and it's just an explosion of gluten-free everything. Gluten-free bread, gluten-free pasta, you name it. It really feels like almost overnight, wheat, this food we've eaten for literally thousands of years, has become public enemy number one. So why? What is actually going on here? And look, this isn't just some passing trend. The numbers are pretty staggering. A major UK study, which was cited by the National Institutes of Health, found a four-fold increase in celiac disease. And that was in just 22 years. 4 times. That's not a small jump. Something is clearly, fundamentally changing in our relationship with wheat. And that really brings us to the core of the paradox, doesn't it? I mean, if we've been eating wheat for something like 10,000 years, why is it all of a sudden causing so many problems for so many people? Well, as it turns out, the answer is way more complicated than just blaming a single protein. So to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to break this explainer down into a 3-part investigation. First, we're going to look at the wheat seed itself. Then, we'll dive into the milling process. And finally, we'll explore the additives hidden in our modern food system. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning with the seed. Is the wheat we eat today actually different from what our great-great-grandparents ate? Well, to figure this out, some researchers did something pretty clever. They took ancient grain varieties, like kamut, and then they took modern wheat varieties, and they grew them side by side, in the exact same organic field. Now, this is key, because it controls for everything, the soil, the water, the sun, so they could really isolate the inherent genetic differences between the plants themselves. So after the harvest, they baked bread from both types of wheat. Then they digested it in a lab to mimic our own digestion and applied those digested samples to human cells. And the findings? They were incredibly clear. The digest from the modern wheat bread triggered a significantly higher inflammatory and oxidative stress response. So, boom, right there is our first big clue. Even when it's grown in the exact same conditions, modern wheat just seems to have more potential to fire up inflammation compared to its ancient relatives. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. All right, on to part 2 of our investigation, the mill. Because how we turn that wheat into flour has gone through this massive industrial transformation. But first, a super quick anatomy lesson. A whole wheat berry has 3 main parts. You've got the bran, that's the fibrous outer layer. You've got the germ, which is the nutrient-rich embryo. And then you have the endosperm, which is mostly just starch and protein. Now remember this. Pretty much all the good stuff, the fiber, the vitamins, the healthy fats, it's all packed into that bran and germ. Okay, so traditional stone milling, it just grinds the entire kernel. So all 3 parts stay together in the final flour. But modern roller milling, that's a totally different game. It's a process of separation. It aggressively strips away the bran and the germ, leaving you with that fine, super shelf-stable white flour that's made almost entirely from the starchy endosperm. And here's the real cost of that efficiency. We lose the vast majority of the fiber, the vitamins, and the minerals. So what do producers do? They try to compensate by adding a packet of synthetic vitamins back in. That's what fortification means on the label. We've basically taken apart a perfect whole food and then tried to glue it back together with artificial parts. Okay, so this brings us to the final and maybe the most fascinating piece of our puzzle, the additives. What are we adding to our processed foods that might be changing how our bodies react to wheat? To get this, we have to understand real quick how celiac disease actually works. In simple terms, it's a 3-step process. First, you eat gluten. Second, its little protein fragments, they're called peptides, somehow get through the wall of your intestine. And then step 3, your immune system launches an attack. Now, that second step, the breach, that's the absolute critical gateway. So the key takeaway here is that for gluten to become the villain, it first needs a way to sneak past your gut's security system. A major 2019 review from the National Institutes of Health actually looked into this, asking a pretty wild question. Could common food additives be acting as accomplices, basically holding the door open for gluten? The researchers pointed their fingers at 2 additives in particular. First, there's an enzyme that has a lovely nickname meatglue, which is used to improve the texture of all sorts of processed foods. And second, there are metallic nanoparticles, like titanium dioxide, which are used as whitening agents in things like pastries and dairy products. So how could these things be involved? Well, the NIH review explains that this meat glue can actually change the gluten peptides themselves.
This modification can essentially make them look even more like a threat, making them bigger, more obvious targets for the immune systems of people with celiac disease.
Now, the nanoparticles seem to work in a totally different way. The theory here is that they can directly damage the tight junctions. Think of them like the mortar between the bricks of your intestinal wall. This can create tiny gaps, what some people call a leaky gut, which could literally let gluten peptides pass right through.
In fact, the NIH review uses this absolutely perfect analogy for it. They say these nanoparticles can act like a Trojan horse. They might actually bind to gluten and carry it undetected right across the intestinal wall to where it can cause damage.
So think of it like this. Your gut wall is a nightclub with a super strict bouncer. These additives might be creating a huge distraction out front, giving troublemakers like gluten peptides the perfect chance to just sneak right past the velvet rope and start causing chaos inside. So, where does this leave us? Let's take a step back and connect all of these dots. We've got three really distinct modern changes that have all happened to this one ancient food. How does it all come together? Well, it really looks like a three-part problem, a kind of triple whammy. First, we started growing wheat that seems to be inherently more inflammatory. Second, our modern milling process strips away the very nutrients that could have helped our bodies deal with it. And third, we're adding all these novel substances that may be opening the gates for those inflammatory compounds to get into our system in the first place. When you look at it this way, you realize there's no single bad guy in this story. It's not just the gluten or just the modern wheat or any single additive. It might be the perfect storm that's created when you combine all of these modern factors together. Which leaves us with one last, really crucial question to think about. Is the problem really wheat itself, this ancient grain that has sustained humanity for millennia? Or is the problem what our modern food system has done to it? Maybe the real answer isn't just slapping a gluten-free label on everything, but taking a much more thoughtful look at the food we create and the food we eat.